cameras. Excited to have you all here. We'll probably wait a minute or two just to let a few last people kind of filter in. But we have a pretty good crowd I see online, which we're really excited about. This is our Extractives-led local economic diversification community of practice. We try to run these webinars about once every month or two, and they're meant at a high level of practitioner and audience in mind in terms of really diving into how to make local content and Extractives-led economic diversification work. Sort of getting past just the broad statements that we all agree with in terms of local content and getting into the actual nuts and bolts of how to make that work. So just as a background for everybody, the Extractives-led local economic diversification community of practice is an online platform for practitioners who focus on local content and related topics. It's a online platform that you register for, so anyone who's on the line who would like to join, they can contact myself or Kyla DeWert from our team. That information I think is in the Goxy post for this webinar, and we can have you signed up if you're a practitioner in this space. Our next webinar should be about the start of November, and we'll provide information out that shortly. We're also about to send out the newsletter reviewing the world of local content in September. That'll come out in the next day or so. And like I say, anyone who's on the line who hasn't had a chance to join, we'd be thrilled to have you join our community of practice, both to engage in the online discussion, but also to share news, whatever you're working on in terms of research. We're always very keen to have the practitioners seek advice and connections on the community. So that's just a little bit of an introduction on the actual community. I will leave it there. Today's content is focused on a really important, challenging issue of how to actually make local content policy by extractive industry companies work at the site level. We've been working on local procurement for a long time, and we hear over and over again that companies can set local high-level local content policy at the corporate level, but there's a lot of difficulty getting site-level implementation. Recently, in I believe it was July, the Responsible Mining Index came out and found very similar data to show that when it comes to mining companies, the number of companies who have high-level pronouncements on issues of local content is quite high, but the number of companies who have really meaningful implementation of policy and reporting at the site level is certainly lacking. So we're really excited to talk about this topic today because we've had a lot of requests from practitioners, consultants, mining companies, and oil and gas companies who struggle with this challenge. So we're going to dive in with two case studies of leading companies in this space. One is Shell, who have set a high bar on local content in the oil and gas sector. Kathy Koo, as a senior advisor with Shell on economic development and local content, and she'll be speaking briefly on Shell's approach on local content on the whole, before we turn to Christine Makabali from Shell Philippines, who is going to work on talk about local content, specifically with their operations in the Philippines. Lastly, Adele Lombard from Anglo American is going to be speaking on the Anglo American's approach. Anglo American is a company that we've followed for a long time on their focus on local content. They've got some interesting toolkits that are used by all their sites, so they also provide a very good model. And lastly, I might add, Isabella, just to make sure, have you hit the recording button for the webinar?
Just Silvana here. Isabella just left the room.
Okay.
Just to add that the whole session will be recorded, and today we actually have the program manager of the trust fund that makes all this initiative and the ELLED program possible.
Oh, fantastic. Really appreciate that. That's great to hear. So it has been. So the recording has started, just to make sure. Oh, I see.
It has started. It has started now.
Okay, perfect. Okay, well, with that, without any further ado, let's turn to Adele first from Anglo American, who we'll start speaking about local content. So, Adele, can you share your slides?
Let me just see if I can figure this out. Can I check that everybody's seeing my slides?
Not yet. Just 1 second, folks. We tried this out 10 minutes ago, so we should be able to get this to work. Adele?
No, I'm trying to share. It's not working.
Are you hitting the share tab, or we did it before? What's happening?
Before. On my side, the share tab has actually disappeared, to be quite honest. So I'm not sure what happened.
Can you hit quick start? Yeah, go hit quick start and press share screen. Do you see that?
There you go.
Aha, there we go.
You see, that's why they pay you the big bucks, Jeff.
Thank you very much. But we're on. We see your screen now.
Okay, that's perfect. Right. So, yeah, thank you very much for the opportunity to share a bit with you. I think many of the participants would have noticed that we've got a slightly different title, which is called Inclusive Procurement. So I'm hoping to share with you today, rather than some of the more exciting slides that I've seen some of the other participants share, I actually wanted to share with you a bit today regarding the journey we've been on, specifically how that relates to local procurement. From an Anglo American point of view, in South Africa, we have quite a bit of legislation dealing with things like local procurement. From the e-policies, which revolves around economic empowerment of certain groupings, to procurement on host communities. So we have an interesting and challenging legislative environment. But as a mining house, we also took a decision quite some time ago to embark on a bit of a journey, and to not be compliance focused, but really to focus on doing the right thing and doing the things that will help us empower our local communities, or we refer to it as host communities. And hence the title Inclusive Procurement. It's about establishing a supply chain and a value chain across the business in all of our business units, which is inclusive and affords fair opportunity for everybody who wants to be included in our supply chain. Now, local procurement, I suppose from a South African context, has two different connotations to it. The one being regional based, which really is about procuring in South Africa. And then the second one revolves around procuring around our operations, and that's been renamed by ourselves and then also by the recently launched mining charter, which was actually gazetted last week, as our host community. So when we talk to local procurement from an Anglo American point of view, we speak about procurement in country. And when we speak about host community procurement, we really talk about the communities who are really on the doorstep of where we operate our mines. So that's just a little bit of context in terms of language. I am trying to see here, my slides are not wanting to skip for some reason. Jeff, can I just check on your side, what slide are you seeing there?
We are seeing the first one, inclusive procurement, why it is important, purpose and objectives and mission.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for that.
Sorry, I was muted there.
My system doesn't seem to want to progress my slides anymore. So you're going to have to excuse me. I'm going to have to fly without slides. Unless you can do something on your side, Jeff, but mine seems to be frozen on this side.
If you can't change it, we can bring up the slides. So just give me a sec. I'll do that.
Okay.
And let me bring up. Perfect. I think. Can you see this, Adele?
I can't see it, but it's quite fine. I've got my my hard copy in my hand. So I'm quite happy as long as the rest of the participants can see the slide.
Yeah. So we'll run your slides then for you. So we're on the slide that says inclusive procurement, our strategy, and it's local, regional versus local host community.
Yes, that's exactly the right place. Thank you, Jeff. So
Perfect.
I think, you know, our time is quite short. So the things that we're focusing on within this new strategy, and then specifically how it links to the local procurement, is focusing on our host community suppliers and broader socioeconomic development opportunities, giving preference to local materials and manufacture, aligning with our broader national, regional and local development plans, and developing a common regional approach to ensure consistent messaging. Now, that all sounds fairly straightforward, but given the context of operating in South Africa and the legal framework within which we operate, this is quite a challenge in terms of aligning a business the size of ours with the various business units in the various provinces. So there's quite a lot of things to attend to from a systems point of view, from a procedure point of view, and then most importantly, as far as communicating with our external stakeholders. I am moving on to the next slide called Inclusive Procurement Vision, just to check. And those really are the three main things that we are focusing at the moment. They are quite wide, but they really encompass the vision of Anglo American as a group, and that is to have a significant socio-economic impact on the host communities and operating regions, boost South African industrialization while meeting or exceeding compliance requirements, and then, very importantly, aligning with our strategic sustainability imperatives to create thriving communities and improve people's livelihoods in our communities. And that really sits at the heart of the new Anglo American Inclusive Procurement Strategy. It is about, as a miner, having a huge impact on the communities where we operate and enabling our staff and our systems to be able to work in an almost seamless manner with these communities. Now, obviously, in terms of rolling out a strategy of this size across all of our business units, which then includes coal, diamonds, iron ore, and platinum. So it's all of our operating entities. We need quite a support structure from a systems point of view, and you know, if I reflect on some of the slides I've seen, for example, about the helicopters, those are the brilliant sort of ideas that we, as not only just as a business but as an industry, need to share amongst each other to see how we can improve across the globe. We have currently our inclusive procurement strategy is focused mainly on South Africa as a rollout region, and that's just largely because of the legislative requirements. But the interesting thing that we've come to realize over the past 12 months as we've rolled out this strategy is across all our operating regions, whether it is South Africa, whether it's Peru, whether it's Australia, it actually is mind-boggling to realize how different but how similar things are in the different operating regions. Sorry, just give me a minute. Sorry, guys. So yeah, I think, in terms of sharing our strategy with you, this is something that we've been doing a roadshow over the last month across all of our operations. And rather than boring you with details, I would like to, when we get to the question and answer section, address some of your questions and the areas that you then specifically may be interested in.
Okay, that sounds good. We just had your slide on inclusive procurement. Are there any more on the slides that we might have missed, just so that we know?
So some of the slides, if you look at the slide called Inclusive Procurement Context, for example,
Yep, right.
There's a circle on the right-hand side. So that really goes on to explain a little bit about what are the different elements of this new strategy. It talks about enablers, so what are the systems, the procedures, the processes which support all of this. And then something we've done very, very differently this time around is you'll see there's a specific scheme for change management and communication. Now, it sounds to be quite a strange addition to a project like this one, but we found when we did the initial scoping of this project that in many cases the reason why local procurement fails is not because the plans aren't good or the supporting structures aren't good, but it's because we are generally not good at communicating what it is that we are doing, and we are very, very poor at making sure that we, at the appropriate time, both in design and implementation, that we include all the relevant stakeholders, which may include both internal and external stakeholders, for example, in our host communities. And then the slide after that was just to indicate, sorry, I'm not a fan of death by PowerPoint, hence, hence I thought I'll share the information and then answer some questions. I think the major differentiator for us is that we've taken a demand-driven inclusive approach. So what does that mean? It means in everything that we do where host community procurement is involved, we really are focusing on matching our demand in terms of what we know is coming up in our supply chain, in terms of where we know technology is moving, all of the things we know that we might demand going forward, and matching that up with supply. And then once you start doing that, you realize also where the development opportunity lies. So, you can only really effectively begin to develop local industries, local suppliers, whatever it is that you require, once you are quite effective at matching your demand and your supply pipelines to make sure that you are developing appropriately. So it really just goes about an integrated approach that's focused on demand rather than sometimes, just trying to do the right thing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, fantastic. That sounds really good. We'll leave it there. As you say, it's better to dive into the discussion. Before we turn over to you, Kathy and Shell, I just want to make sure everybody knows that if they have questions, they can start setting them on the chat function. And what we'll do is we'll keep an eye on them and make sure that they are asked during the follow-up Q&A at the end of the Shell presentation. So please start sending questions in, and let's turn over to Kathy right now.
Okay, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. It's Kathy Koo. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Great. Okay, I don't want to steal the show from my colleague Christine Makabali. I'm just going to do what Jeff asked me to do and set a little bit of the scene of what Shell's ambitions are in the local content space, what have we done in the past, and what do we plan to do in the future. So I'll just have 2 slides just to walk you through. I just joined Shell in January from the World Bank, where I worked a lot on economic development and local content issues and trying to make them work on the ground. And, I was wondering, what is Shell as a company actually going to do in the local content space? Are you serious, Shell, that you're interested? And yes, it seems like I was very happy to see that local content sits very squarely within Shell's 3 ambitions. And I wanted to go through those with you. Shell's 3 ambitions are articulated in the sense that, yes, as a company and a corporate, we want to be a world-class investment case. So we want to deliver value to our shareholders, first and foremost, and to run a profitable and successful business. So that's the first, the world-class investment case. The second, which I won't talk about directly, is about thriving in the energy transition. So how does Shell transform itself from an oil and gas company into an energy company? And so a lot of articulation and strategy around how we transfer into renewables and become more carbon efficient in our operations, et cetera. And the third is on the strong license to operate, which is primarily where the local content discussion sits, but it also links, as you can see, with the world-class investment case, because the philosophy of local content, or at least Shell's philosophy, is that this is a win-win for both the country that we operate in as well as for our business. And you'll see that the next presentation from Christine is going to outline exactly how it was a win for both. So right now, the license to operate is probably familiar to you in the sense that Shell, for a very long time, has been engaging in fence line, frontline support to the communities that we operate in. And this relates to maintaining business continuity, our business operations, and what I would call philanthropic CSR type initiatives. That has been a Shell standard for many decades. What is slightly different now is that we have gotten very high-level support from the CEO down through his executive committee to say, well, can't we do a little bit more than just be a nice player for our community, because it really is in some ways self-serving, and it doesn't always transform the trajectory of a country. And so, it's not often that community suppliers become national players or regional players or even global players. So maybe we need to zoom out a little bit and look at it from a national level. And so what we have gotten as a mandate is to say, let's see what countries that we can move beyond compliance, beyond just pure legal compliance. And in some countries, the Australians, the Canadians, there are not what you call the hard targets, which are set in national legislation. But, so beyond just meeting those legal requirements, what can we do which actually delivers true domestic value add, in-country value to our operations? And what does this require? So if you move to the next slide, we'll take a look here. It's something which I would say is the 3 Ps, is Shell's 3 Ps, policy, people, and private sector. And that is, if you talk about it in terms of extractive industry language, the private sector is really what we would call the procurement. So the nuts and bolts is who are you buying from, who are you getting your supplier base from, is it global, is it regional, and is it national? So that's really where we say, yeah, we could do a better job in assessing the market, forecasting what our demands are going to be in the medium and long term, and letting the government know what those are, the government and the suppliers know what those intentions are. And that's where one of the P's sits on the government space, is really communicating and trying to link in with what government's ambitions are for their short, medium, and long-term development. Okay, and the people part is what I said earlier, is based on our work with communities, both in terms of training and financing. And I know that Jeff wanted me to say this, that a lot of this stuff was driven from headquarters here in The Hague, but you know, Shell is a careful company as well, and what we want to do is actually take a close look at the success cases that we as a company have done, and you'll see this in the next presentation, and to replicate with pride. So the clear guidance is to say we're not going to drive something out of headquarters and make it yet another initiative that our assets just groan at when we show up. What we really want to say is, look, this is what a successful in-country value proposition looks like in the Philippines. Isn't there something that we could do in our operations in Trinidad and elsewhere in the world that would help us at least be focused and knowing that we can replicate these examples repeatedly? Okay, I'm happy to answer any questions, or else I can turn it over to Christine to take over the show.
That's fantastic. We're going to hold questions till the end until we get a really wide-ranging discussion. So that's fantastic. Let's turn to Christine. And Christine, if you could just hit the share your slides and start unmute yourself.
Yep. Sharing. Do you see my screen?
Yeah, we can hear you see your screen. You're a little faint, so maybe just move a little bit closer to the microphone.
Okay, now do you see the screen?
Yes, looks great.
So first, thank you all for giving Shell an opportunity to speak at this forum. So as Kathy had said, so my name is Christine Macabali. So I'm the logistics manager for Shell Philippines Exploration, which is an upstream business for Shell in the Philippines. So I'm actually quite nervous because as a logistician, I'm usually in the background rather than presenting. But what I'm about to share is an example of how we've been able to operationalize local content in a contract. So, before I start, I'd like to share about the asset that we operate, which is Malampaya. So, Malampaya is quite a significant asset for the Philippines because it's probably the only significant upstream asset, and it's an excellent example of a private and public partnership. So, the joint venture is between Shell, Chevron, and PNOC, which is the Philippine National Oil Company. And this project has actually reduced our country's dependence on imported fuel by about 30%. And we do garner quite a significant portion of foreign exchange earnings from export. And we like to say that we power 1 out of 3 lights of Luzon, which is the main, one of the main 3 islands, and it's actually the main industrial sector for the country. So it's a project that's really focused on supporting national development by delivering clean and indigenous energy. And the case itself is around how we've been able to train and develop Philippine nationals in technical roles for offshore aviation. So the companies that were involved were Specs as the operator of the JV project, which is the asset Malampaya, and Helicopters New Zealand, who is actually our helicopter services providers. So the results were really around local content being delivered to address the needs of both parties. So when we started the contract in 2013, we had 22 expatriate technical staff. So when we say technical staff in aviation, we're actually referring to the high-skill roles, such as those of the pilots or the avionics engineers. So in 2013, we had 22, which was really the full complement of pilots and engineers for the contract. And as of September, we actually have 9 out of the 22 technical roles which are being occupied by Philippines. I think one of the key enablers of this initiative being successful is a local content policy which we have in the Philippines. It's actually a Shell companies in the Philippines local content policy. So it applies to any Shell company operating in our country. And that's really because Skip sees local content as essential for economic growth as well as development of the Philippines. So Shell in the Philippines in particular, I feel, has such strong ties to sustainable development and nation building. And I think that's the heart of this policy. So, uh, I mean, what are the key things about it that I feel has enabled the success of the initiative? So, one of it is it's actually an appendix in every contract that we enter to, meaning contractors who bid and who get accepted and they sign into the contract with this as an appendix essentially commit to developing local content in that contract. And it also clearly defines what local content means. So it's indicated as a utilization of Filipino talent or material resources rather than perhaps maybe capitalization or, um, for example, or a local asset. And also indicate a requirement that local content be quantitatively measured. And that's how we were able to apply it to this initiative. It's quite, I mean, I find it quite easy to talk about it now, but actually, in terms of our journey, it hasn't really been that straightforward. So we started the contract in 2013. So it was actually awarded to Helicopters New Zealand, who had to take on a local partner. And at that time, all the technical staff were expatriate. And the contract just ran as it was expected. There was already a local content policy in place, um, but we didn't have a firm plan at the time that or that we monitored or tracked to actually attain the vision or the goal of increasing the local content within the contract. However, we all know that by 2014, the dropping oil prices actually affected not just oil and gas ourselves, but related industries as well. And Specs, just like many companies in the industry, participated extensively in industry benchmarking and found a number of cost efficiency opportunities. And one of them was actually the Helicopters New Zealand contract. And that's where that was our opening to be able to renegotiate the contract with H&Z, initially with the view to reduce contract costs. But during that process, we actually recognized that by putting in a nationalization plan, that it could actually allow us to meet both of our objectives. So I'll explain more about that later. But in essence, by having to go through that journey and realizing that nationalization or local content doesn't have to be a burden, or at times I feel that it's sometimes seen as an additional cost. Um, eh, if we understand exactly what we need and what we can attain, then it's actually a win-win for both parties. So, for example, now 9 out of 22 technical staff are actually Filipino nationals, and I think H&Z's experience of it has been so positive that they have actually initiated a technical on-the-job training program with a local university within the municipality wherein the heli base operates. And they've actually recruited another local engineer that's already on top of what we had initially agreed. So this is them realizing or seeing the benefit in it and actually going beyond what they had committed. So H&Z is actually the only operator of offshore and night-rated performance class 1 helicopters in the Philippines. So in terms of national legislation, what we have is really limited to capitalization requirements. It doesn't extend to local employment necessarily. So for example, for aviation industries, at least 60% of Filipino ownership is required. So you see that in many industries in the Philippines. So in practice, it's usually Filipino partners being engaged as agents. So the gains are really mostly financial or commercial, and there's no technology transfer. So once the contract ends, the foreign entity packs up, and basically the local entity can look for another agent, another company to partner with as an agent. So we saw negotiations with H&Z as a win-win opportunity. Shell offered them or leveraged a contract extension of 5 years, which is quite attractive at the time because it allowed them 5 years of continued revenue, knowing that it was a period of downturn. And for us, we saw it as a means to maintain our business continuity. I mean, there is a lot of transition risks related to bringing in new contractors, and there's always, birthing pains. And H&Z was a very good operator. They had high health, safety, security, and environmental assurance compliance, very good performance and delivery, and they're already very familiar with the Philippine operating environment. So apart from that was, of course, the targeted cost reduction. And at the same time, of course, it was now our opportunity to successfully implement the nationalization plan. And in this, H&Z was actually also upfront to say that they felt at that point in time that being able to successfully implement the nationalization plan, particularly for technical talent, was also something they saw as key in being able to bid and win contracts within the region. So how are we able to do it? So it's really, I split it up to three components. So one is around training and development. So we recognized H&Z was the expert. So they manage the training process and we monitored it. So we have in-house aviation technical authority that conducted biweekly site visits to the heli base that allowed them to engage with local staff, understand their pains, understand how the development process was going. And the H&Z base manager also had clear oversight of the program. And then leadership and commitment was also very key. So the contract owners, which is my boss technically, our general manager, and his counterpart within H&Z, it was always an agenda discussion in the quarterly business performance review. It became a KPI that we discussed. And if there were potential delays, we were also very open to discuss them and find out how we can recover the original plan. And then in terms of who paid for it, actually all of the training costs were borne by Helicopters New Zealand. So the contract covered recurrent training for already competent pilots, so which Shell would pay for, but it would only apply once the pilots actually attained the necessary competency and certification. And then, as part of the negotiations, H&Z actually had to walk the talk. So it wasn't enough to say that they were committed. There had to be a means to make that commitment firm. So actually, the contract costs coming out of the negotiations, the rates, they assumed on-time implementation of the program. Thus, if H&Z delayed in any way, they actually also bore the commercial risk. There were a couple of key challenges. So one, with H&Z operating the only aircraft of its type in the country, there was actually a limited local market for local talent that actually already had technical experience, or what they call type training in the aircraft type. So H&Z was actually very open to bring that up to us a few months after the negotiations when they had difficulty recruiting. So Shell also had to be open to revise the plan and have it undergo revisions on the time to account for the time required to build capability and experience. And there were also no other local resources or assets wherein Filipino pilots could be trained. So training had to be undertaken in a number of locations around the world. So mainly Malaysia, Italy, for the engineering, and New Zealand, where the H&Z base headquarters is. And once they were trained, they also had to gain exposure and experience. So they call it hours. They had to generate a number of hours before they could actually meet the competency. So they obtained it at H&Z's operational sites in both New Zealand and Papua New Guinea. So these are our results, which I've actually already said earlier. So we have 9 out of 22 technical roles occupied by Filipinos. I actually added this other bullet, which our H&Z heli base manager reminded me to say, is that other than them having attained full competency in these technical roles, 2 of the local pilots are actually close to commencing their command progression scheme, which means they're actually quite close to being granted a captaincy. And they have actually also taken up additional roles on the base around flight data management and flight safety. So they're doing something beyond um, piloting, which in itself is already high technical capability. And at the same time, H&Z is targeting to develop an additional local pilot, which they expect to hire by 20. When we were doing an after-action review, they also recognized that it's actually increased operational flexibility for them because local pilots living within the Philippines could easily be mobilized if for any reason there was a shortage or an emergency wherein the on-duty pilots had to leave. And then we had to measure it because that was part of the local content policy. So apart from measuring it in the local content numbers, we also wanted to measure it in terms of the financial results. For Shell, it actually reduced our contract manpower costs 660,000 US dollars a year. And over the remaining contract life, including the extension we had granted them, it was around 3.8 million. And for H&Z, that additional contract extension is expected to yield them around 47 million in gross revenues. So just to go through our key success factors, it's really around the relationship with the contractor so that you can discuss, collaborate, and challenge. And I think one area where we were quite lucky, and perhaps some practitioners might not have the luck, that there's alignment of values and beliefs between the parties. So H&Z felt that they had to be successful and they had to do this because it was already part of the rules of the game now. It's no longer like it was before. And indeed, as Kathy said, it also in a way made them a better investment case than they used to be. And I think the third was around creating joint ownership for the program by making it smart. So having actual targets that can be measured, that also had commercial implications that are contractually agreed, kept live, and monitored regularly. And we also agreed on the right priorities. So I mentioned before that during the initial run of the program in the first year, we actually had to rejig the timing of the schedule because we agreed up front that Filipinos would not move up in the program if they're not able to meet the standards. So we still wanted to prioritize safety and competence. And we wanted to them to have the confidence to be able to take on the roles when they were ready so that even if there was a commercial benefit to both of us, safety and competence were still the priority. And finally, what were our other lessons learned? So I think one was around the leadership and commitment, the behavior of Shell, where we made it clear to our vendor partner that this is a focus area. It was important to us in that we wanted it to be measured. And actually, it wasn't just done through those contract engagements. So we actually have regular forums with our contractors, and local content is a regular topic of discussion. And the second was around leveraging the internal knowledge within the organization and with our contractor partners across relevant disciplines. So for us, we had to bring in aviation technical experts or technical authorities from Shell, HSE, people from finance and contracting and procurement when we negotiated and also when we developed the plan so that we can collaborate effectively and everybody can share their right expertise so we can succeed and have successful outcomes. So finally, I end this presentation with just a picture of the team at the base. It's just one of the shifts. So the pilots and engineers are actually split across shifts, and the person under the yellow arrow is me. So thank you, everyone, and I look forward to your Q&A.
Thanks very much. A really inspiring story, not only for the impact created, but obviously also you mentioned the dollars saved, which I think is obviously what a number of companies and people in the line have to care about most when it comes to their own roles. So that's really exciting. So really exciting also that you got into some of the back end methods to make that work in terms of KPIs and some of the nuanced approaches that I think a lot of companies struggle with. So really appreciate your presentation. So I'm from there. Let's just go into Q&A. I know that there's a lot of questions on the line, so I'm going to I'll wait to draw on those in a few minutes after some people chime in on the line. And I know that Savannah herself from the World Bank office there had some questions, so I'll open it up to questions and we'll go from there. And remember, you have to unmute yourself because you've been most people have been muted for the sake of the presentations.
Hi, this is Jeremy Strauss from FCI. Over my 6 years or so at the bank, I've been quite preoccupied with local procurement, inclusive procurement, and local economic development and extractives. I have a question for Christine about the specific project. I just wanted to understand, because I can understand that there was a deficiency in the skills available in the Philippines for these helicopter pilots. Now, I also would assume that there would be helicopters being used regularly in the Philippines. And so I was curious if just across the general usage of helicopters in the Philippines, were there Filipino pilots flying those helicopters? If there were, what would be the essential differences between the skill set needed to meet Shell's needs and the skill set to just, I guess, pilot helicopters? Thanks.
Yeah. Hi. To clarify, so yes, we do have helicopter pilots in the Philippines. Many, and actually most of the pilots that we have on our program have come from either military or commercial piloting. The key difference is around the aircraft type. So in 2013, most of the aircraft, helicopter aircraft that were actually operating in the Philippines were performance class 2. The key difference really lies around the safety instrumentation, and Shell is quite firm in terms of our managing our trips and our safety, that the aircraft that needed to be used was actually performance class 1. So the key difference actually, in layman's terms, is a performance class 1 aircraft. The likelihood of a crash is similar to the likelihood of a crash of a commercial fixed-wing airline, which is very, very rare, whereas performance class 2 are the types of aircraft which have been involved in many of the fatalities within our industry. So actually, as a standard, we only use performance class 1 aircraft, and even in countries like the Philippines where it's considered remote operations. So what we would typically do in Shell is actually to bring in an operator, and in this case, we would ask them to build local content and try to hire Filipinos if they could, and if not, to develop them. So it was actually easier years back when that standard was not yet in place. But I understand that we put it in for safety reasons. So what just happened for us in this initiative is it made the timeline longer.
Thanks.
I have a question, Silvana here. I have a question for Adele. You mentioned that your inclusive procurement strategy is designed around two themes. One is the local communities right around the mine site, and one is the region itself. And in fact, in the inclusive procurement strategies, you mentioned that two important points. The alignment with broader national, regional, and local development plans, and the development of a common regional approach to ensure consistent messaging. On these two targets, I'd have a couple of questions. How do you exactly align Anglo strategy to national, regional, and local development plans? Who do you involve? Do you work with regional authorities, local think tanks? And also, to develop a common regional approach, are you working across your mine sites or across the industry or across several industries in the region?
I check that you can hear me.
Yes, we can.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. So your first question was, how do we align with national, regional, local, and so on developmental strategies? that's quite a challenging thing to do. But I think briefly, there are various levels that we are trying to align with, and there are various, I almost want to say, sub-strategies and sub-projects which link into the larger inclusive procurement project. So I think the easier one to link up with is our national development strategies. So our government has been quite clear, especially in the last 2 or 3 years, around where we see ourselves going as a country. And significantly, that then is around transformation on the one side that affects our industry quite heavily. And then secondly is national, regional, and local strategies around what we call local manufacture. So I think the one thing we've realized as a country is to really create significant growth from an economic point of view, and then also looking at the creation of jobs, both on national level and regional or local level, is we need to start looking at local manufacture, import replacement. So those typically are the things that we are trying to align with. However, the challenge with that is that in order to be really successful with many of these initiatives, one has to really be able to aggregate demand. You cannot start developing local manufacturing entities or looking at things like import replacement until you've got quite a good grasp on what your aggregated demand is. And I think that sort of links up to your second question as well. We've realized as an industry in the country that we really need to try and drop a little bit of the barriers around us to get to the point where we can aggregate demand and where we can look at jointly moving forward. There are challenges with regards to legislation around competition law and so on. But we found that if we are a little bit creative around how we deal with many of these things, we actually can move quite a bit forward jointly rather than each guy trying to do his own thing. That being said, it all sounds very ambitious and inspirational. I'm not for 1 minute saying that it's been an easy task. Creating common messaging, common practices, common standards, just for us as a business, has been quite a challenge, because historically a lot of our business units have joined the greater business at different times. They have to adhere to various pieces of legislation. So one really requires really almost a bit of an umbrella approach to be able to attend to all of these things simultaneously.
Many thanks, Adele. Actually, your last sentence is very interesting, because you were saying that even across the business units within Anglo, you obviously needed to come up with common standards, common approaches, which is not that easy. So obviously doing that across the different companies might even be more challenging. What institutional mechanism have you found more successful in order to develop such common approach and standards? We heard from Shell what they are trying to do. What is Anglo approach to create a common culture around local content development?
Well, for us, it has been as simple as starting to standardize things like terminology and systems. Looking from the outside in, people might find that to be surprising as an answer. But just something like local procurement that we are discussing today, we have actually, as a company, almost canned the word local procurement, for want of a better description. Why, might you ask? Well, we found that across our entire business, you could ask any individual in any business unit, in any role, what their definition of local procurement was, and you would get a slightly different answer, slightly too large, depending on who you asked. So we found really that it took a lot of baby steps, starting right from the foundation of what do we call things. So what is a host community? What is our understanding of local procurement? And then taking it into more difficult things like trying to align on standards and policies, aligning on systems. So we have, and that's historically, that's just how things panned out. But we have across many of our business units, we find that people don't make use of the same systems. Everything from ERPs to financial systems, and all of that makes it very difficult to get a common regional approach. So the answer is quite wide. You start right from the foundation in terms of what do you call things, what is a host community, what is a host community supplier, up to aligning scorecards, aligning policies, aligning standards, aligning systems. So really it was a very holistic approach.
Many thanks, Adele.
Sorry, just unmuting myself there. Great, I'm going to go to a question in the chat. One of the questions that's come up here is, how are supplier development programs funded and who delivers it? In-house experts and or third parties? I would imagine that both Shell and Anglo American, you've interacted with different supplier development programs, some which you've probably run yourself and some that you have run in partnership with other groups. So it would be great if maybe, since you just spoke, Adele, if Christine and Kathy, if you have any comments on supplier development programs that you work with.
Jeff?
Yep.
Yeah, so I'm not sure if Kathy's still on the call because I believe she has another meeting afterwards, but I think I could share perhaps some of my experiences in the Philippines.
Great.
And also in Malaysia, where I was actually posted for a while. So it works both ways. So sometimes local content supplier development is actually, you might say, Shell puts in an initial investment. It recognizes bringing in local content and poses challenges for the supplier, and as a means of support, it allows them to pay the supplier a premium up to a certain point. Where we found that works is where there's a clear plan for deliverables, wherein the supplier recognizes that the premium applied is not forever, it's not for the whole duration of the contract, and it's phased in accordance to the development of the local content. And other ways we do it is really around competitive tendering and including it in the scope and making it explicit. In which case now suppliers that wish to tender for work with Shell actually have to explore the host country or the host community, as Adele calls it, to try to understand how they can actually make that part of the service that they offer to Shell, and it becomes a cost that's included within the contract. And actually, the latter, we actually see more of it now because the market is so competitive. I think local content is one of those things that are considered must-dos now. There are things that companies like ours need to win, and suppliers actually recognize that.
Great. Do you have anything to add, Adele, on that?
Yeah, I think just checking. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, so I think it's quite a similar approach. We've got various tiers of supply development. So the brief answer would be, it is largely supplied and or funded by ourselves as a company. In the first instance, however, we also have started to, in all of our a large contract with OEMs, who's our original equipment manufacturers, as well as large construction contractors. So really all of our larger service providers, to also put very clear requirements in their contract with regards to skills development and supply development. So in the first instance, supplied by ourselves, we also have an in-house business called Anglo American, whose focus is specifically on supplier and enterprise development. But then also on the second tier, to make sure we have a bit of reach beyond just our own, to also have in all of our big contracts requirements for third parties to also do supplier and enterprise development, appropriately obviously to the scope and the size of the contract.
Okay, great. Any other questions online before I go to another one on the chat? And like I said, you may have to unmute your microphone.
Hello, my name is Michele Renda and I'm a consultant here at the World Bank. So I have a question for both Anglo American and Shell. It's paramount, this engagement, I think, with the government and with their strategy on local procurement. But how do you address the issues like, I mean, when you feel that there is a lack of transparency in the local procurement policy that could not really boost competition and growth in the sense that the private sector wishes? Any examples of the challenges of this type that you have overcome? Thank you.
Shall I give it a go first to Cadell from Anglo?
Yes, I think so. I certainly think that you might have there's certainly some high-profile cases around where you operate on that question. So.
Yeah. So it's quite interesting that you would bring this up. When we started working on our new strategy, we did quite a bit of, let's call it, fact-finding. And one of the main criticisms aimed not only at us but at industry generally in South Africa is lack of transparency, lack of opportunity, and access to opportunity sort of walk hand in hand with lack of transparency. Now, obviously, there are always governance concerns that one has to attend to. But in terms of a bit of soul searching, we did realize that actually we were not as accessible and as transparent as we thought we were. And therefore, that was one of the main things that we had to address in our new strategy. So again, a bit of baby steps approach for us. We are starting off with a much more open and transparent procurement process, making use of very old school local newspapers, local radio stations, which we find works well in our host communities. But we're also fast in the process of developing something a bit more elegant, web-based mobile solutions. Something that's quite important in our context is access to mobile solutions is a challenge. And then also something as simple as data in some of our remote communities are quite a challenge. So in terms of improving access, improving transparency, a whole lot of things going on, starting off with very, very traditional methods of communication, sharing, involving, engaging, and then very fast trying to move to something a bit more elegant, yet still very accessible.
Okay, thank you. Shell, any examples you want to give?
Yeah, hi, Jeff. Kathy is actually trying to speak, but she's asking if she can be unmuted at your end.
Isabella, I think it's on your end. I think some of the there's a couple other people who mentioned they think they can't unmute themselves. She's asking which one is Kathy. I think you're it might be a call-in user, which is the difficulty. There is it. It's sorry. It's Shell is the name. Isabella.
Hi. Now can you hear me? I've been
Yes.
unmuted.
There we go.
Great. Okay. No, it's a really good question. This thing about the transparency, and I'm not going to say that it's been easy, you know, for Shell to try and ensure that we are, you know, to trying to comply with government wishes when the competitive landscape is just not there. And so in some of the cases, including one sort of in helicopter, government not for Philippines, but in other cases where government has tried to steer us and heavily encouraged us to try and, you know, take certain suppliers on board and to train them. So it's an ongoing issue. It really falls into the realm of sort of ethics and compliance and how you operate as a good company. And, you know, so on every one of these tender board bids, we run through, you know, these dilemmas with our ethics and compliance team for advice. So it's not perfect by all means, but it's clear that we have an eye on it. Does that help?
Well, yes, that's the answer I expected, but still I understand and I know that the government makes pressure sometimes irrespective of private companies' policies. So, yeah, it's I understand that you just entertain a dialogue with them in that case, right?
Yeah, I mean, it depends really on the context that we're operating in. And so in some cases where government has very heavy local content requirements, which are unrealistic, the question then is that do we have solid evidence to say to the government, you know, as a company or as an industry, that what you're asking for is simply not realistic? And what I'm finding is that in order for Shell to be on the front foot, it does require that we do some of this upfront work as a company, the market research, the market intelligence, that we engage with external donors and actors like the World Bank or the African Development Bank, who actually will do some of these studies, you know, just as a way, as a forward-looking piece of research for the development of a country. So I know the World Bank and the IOCs did this kind of work in Tanzania, for example, to say what's realistically possible in the local content space. Yeah. But despite that, there is still tremendous pressure from the government to direct awards and things to certain companies, and that's a fact.
I think that's a really fantastic insight, and certainly we've been seeing more and more about the value of information sharing on that. Very, very much for that point about being able to talk to the government about specifically what is realistic and what is not. So it's a reoccurring theme. I've got another question here on the line from Samine, who asked, I guess he wants to go back a step on the helicopter contract and sort of get to how it was awarded in the first place. So obviously, it was a New Zealand company, but it had a contingent of trying to bring in local nationals to work. So maybe can you speak a little bit to the process of that tender process to get to that company in the first place, and maybe if and how local employees were involved in that process in terms of scoring?
Yeah, so the contract was actually acquired through a global tender. So we actually have what we term as category managers, so they're responsible for overseeing contracting and procurement for certain categories. So for logistics, then you would have aviation, marine, or land. And aviation being you might say, a high cost um, service, what the strategy was to consolidate global demand and to tender globally. Companies could choose to tender for specific countries or for the full portfolio of contracts being offered during that tender. So you might say during that exercise, there were some locals involved. The logistics manager at the time was definitely involved, but it was more to provide input onto the demand rather than the actual strategy. It was only actually when the contract was awarded that we put in local terms and conditions, which included this local content policy.
Yeah, and it's interesting, it's Kathy, if you go back and again, I talk about replicating with pride, is that what did we learn from, our experience in terms of our procurement strategy? And a lot of the questions we get is, well, these EPC contracts are global, and because they're global, it's very difficult for Shell to unlock. Well, in some of our more recent negotiations with our EPCs, we do put carve-outs in so that we can selectively identify categories which we think there is local content potential, and that the EPC contractor would have to then take a look, at that specific category. But Shell definitely does the homework, has to do the homework in order to do that. So very similar to what Christine was talking about, in that, they said, well, this is an opportunity for cost saving and nationalization. It was a proactive contracts and procurements team which led to this outcome. H&Z probably wouldn't have done this necessarily of their own initiative.
So Minnie just added a follow-up on that one. So why did Shell pick this particular service to focus on local procurement? So obviously the helicopter tender came out on an international basis, but you've decided to focus on that one. Maybe talk about the process to get to that decision to focus on that particular service line.
It was really around unlocking value for the contract. So after the industry downturn, we went through a lot of benchmarking. We wanted to find which were the contracts where there was actually opportunity to reduce and how we could possibly reduce them. And those benchmarks actually helped. And we recognized it. Although the negotiations was actually larger in scale, so the local content in terms of nationalization of the pilots and engineers was only one portion of it. There were also other areas which we negotiated to make the cost more efficient, you might say. But I think one of the key areas is really around the use of local talent. Clearly, labor costs in the Philippines, even for technical talent, would be significantly lower than pilots coming from New Zealand or Australia, for example. And at the same time, it actually allowed us to be able to sustain the talent locally, so that in the future, if, for example, because the contract still has a definite life and we retender, then we're also aware that there's actually local talent with that capability. And whether they end up with us in the future, we know that there is technology and knowledge transfer. We actually also did it for a number of other contracts, although those were not specifically focused on local content, but rather it was really around unlocking the value. It was looking at which were the contracts where there was still value to be gained based on the benchmarks.
Any other questions on the line there?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Oops. Yeah. Yes. Go ahead.
Just one. I don't recall if it was Adele or Kathy who mentioned that in some cases these supplier development programs are focused on local manufacturers and import replacement. Could you talk a little bit about examples of categories where supplier development in terms of local manufacturing has worked? In what categories is that, how did that come about, and how early stage, so to speak, did the company get involved to develop the local manufacturers?
Adele, did you want to talk about that, or I can mention a little bit of what Shell's done?
Yeah, I'm also happy. Maybe both of us. This seems to be a hot topic everywhere.
I know. It's good. We're in high demand.
You go.
Okay. I mean, what I just wanted to sort of step back a little bit is that there are two types of interventions that Shell makes on the supplier development side. One sort of sits in our social performance team, and where we do try and support local suppliers, to give us things that we probably wouldn't necessarily source locally. Some of these are called super local content initiatives, where we'll work with somebody like a shale shaker or a very local company to set up a co-op, which might be able to provide us with some goods, which, in the next 5 to 10 years. So if you look at some of the examples where we've worked in Oman, during the Arab Spring and the crisis, there was a lot of focus on this local supplier development as a way of trying to generate employment and economic opportunity. But it's clear that, from a pure business perspective, it wouldn't have made sense, because these local small and medium enterprises would take 5 to 10 years to sort of incubate. So that is from that channel. And the types of activities we do in that space are really only specific for the locality. I mean, we'll even develop pineapple farming in some countries, not because we eat a lot of pineapples or we expect the community to export pineapples, but because it's just one of those things that we do as part of our social investment. The other side of the equation is when we're really saying, okay, we want to do something which is transformative for the country. And in this case, for example, we'll work with, in Kazakhstan, we have done work in trying to set up a laboratory where they provide services to us. And again, it's a long-term process. It's a 5-year process. But we'll go through and we'll train the PhD scientists. We'll invest in the capital for the lab, knowing that in the medium and long run, it will generate returns for us as a business. We don't have to send lab samples out to the Netherlands. We can have them processed in Kazakhstan, and for a fraction of the cost, a couple hundred versus several thousand for the sample. And so, so that is one where it's a win-win for the business. But definitely, I would separate these two types of interventions because they're very different in terms of their impact, transformational impact.
Yeah. Do you hear me?
Yep, of course.
Okay, sorry. I'm just keep on checking because my connection is not so great on this side. So yeah, very similar answer. It's like I said earlier, it's actually amazing once you start talking how different but similar things are across the world. So we have two areas that we focus on. One is called enterprise development, which really is focusing on developing enterprises and businesses which are not necessarily linked to our supply chain. Now, that can be anything like the pineapples you just mentioned, but it can be farming, game ranching, hair salons, really anything not linked to our supply chain. And then the second aspect is supply development, and that's obviously where our main focus is. So those are the development of suppliers which are linked some way or another to our supply chain. I think, we have done quite a bit of work in capturing some of the easy things. So, for example, the manufacture of PPE, which is, safety gloves, safety goggles, that sort of thing. But to really gain traction and make a difference, given where we are as an economy, one has to start looking at the big ticket items. So what are we doing from a practical point of view? We have done an assessment across all of our spend categories to get a very, very good understanding of what that we spend our money on. Where does it come from? Where are the opportunities with regards to local manufacture, with regards to host community? So really just getting a very, very good understanding of where our money is going and what the opportunities are. And then secondly, the key thing, and that's where we are at the moment, is to really start partnering. Um, when I spoke about earlier, I said, we need to focus on aggregation of demand. So we are working with some of the other mining houses, as well as some of our big OEMs, equipment suppliers, to jointly see where the real opportunities are. Because frankly, there is absolutely no point for any one organization to try and do something of this scale. So our focus currently is the big ticket items, and it is really focusing on getting an understanding of what opportunities are, number one, and number two, who we can and should partner with, and that ranges from competitors to government to equipment suppliers, everyone across the board who can play a role in this.
Great, thanks so much. We just have a couple minutes left, so maybe if anybody has any really burning questions, I don't know, Savannah, if you have any questions there from the
I have a question
World Bank.
here again.
Go ahead.
Hi, I just want to make a quick question. It's João Basso from FCI. So just a quick question. You talked a little bit about the local requirements that Shell has with 60% of capital on the Philippines. I'm just curious if the interaction with the government, and this question actually is for both of you, it changed in the periods, just because I think, as you were saying, we had a 2014 crisis in the oil, and we also had a 2009 crisis in platinum. And I was just curious if the interaction with the government in times of crisis, it changes with local requirements increasing and basically government pushing for more hiring local people. How do you see this trend, if it makes sense?
Okay. I mean, I'm happy to take this question on the Shell side, but just to be clear, that the 60% equity requirement on the Philippine side is because aviation, it was considered a sensitive sector in the country, and that's not uncommon that the governments will lock down sectors which they feel are in the best interest of national security. I mean, Trump uses this all the time, right? But in this case, Philippines, it was a long-standing requirement. It wasn't something that was put in place as a result of the drop in the oil prices. The other part is, yes, I mean, we're definitely seeing a squeeze across the board where when the drop in the oil prices did prompt us as well as governments to tighten the screws, if you will, on the local content requirements. And we are in the middle of doing that. That's also one reason why we go on the front foot. In some of these countries in North America, for example, governments which traditionally had never had local content requirements suddenly decided that they wanted to have them in the oil and gas sector. And again, you do your homework, you aggregate the demand, as Adele said, then you can show that perhaps, the country is not able to deliver everything for that demand using only their domestic supply base.
Yeah, I think maybe to add to that from an Anglo American perspective, we have, most of you on the call will know, we've got quite a complex political and social environment in South Africa. Mining is governed by various pieces of legislation, but most significantly, we have something called the Mining Charter, which is very specific in terms of the requirements around local procurement, in terms of economic empowerment, in terms of ownership, local manufacture, and very prescriptive to the extent that non-compliance can lead to losing your mining license. Now, this piece of legislation actually went through another review, and the latest version was gazetted last week. So we are still sort of dealing with the shockwaves coming from that. And amongst others, for example, it carries very, very heavy targets around local manufacture, which at this point in time, across industry, we're working really hard at achieving this. But really, a lot of these pieces of legislation is drafted in response to some of the social and political difficulties that we have. So we have quite a challenging operating environment from a legislation point of view, especially in terms of prescriptiveness around certain things, and then the difficulty in achieving some of those requirements is quite a bit of a challenge.
Great.
Thanks.
Okay, well, we're just hitting up at 11 o'clock at the tail end of things, so I think we'll close it there. Really appreciate you joining us, Kathy, Christine, and Adele. Some really interesting nuance to these questions that, again, we see a lot of questions and concerns being raised by mining companies and oil and gas companies on how to actually make this work. So we really appreciate this. This webinar has been recorded, so this is going to be posted on the ELLED community of practice, as well as we'll put it on the GOXI post as well that was more public. Like I said before, if anyone on the community is not currently a member, anyone on the call who is not currently a member, they can reach out to us. Say you could just use the GOXI link to find the information or the flyer, and we'll put you on the COP. And like I say, we'll be in touch with the newsletter reviewing September in terms of local content around the world, and we'll also be in touch quite soon with the information on the next webinar, which, like I say, should happen at the beginning of November in the same format on WebEx. So, okay, so thanks everybody, and I'll maybe throw it to Savannah if you have any last comments or questions.
Yes, Jeff, I just wanted to add that this discussion will continue online on the community of practice. So questions that were not made or fully answered can be posted online, and we'll try to post a summary of the discussion anyway. And I also want to thank Christine, Kathy, and Adele. We had today our own quality control in the room. That was the program manager of the trust fund that supports this initiative and the entire Extractive local economic diversification program, and our impression is that he is satisfied of the quality of discussion and the importance of this topic. So we thank you particularly for giving us a wonderful performance that will maintain this program.
Okay, thanks everybody. Well, like I say, this recording will be online, and we'll follow up online on the COP with further discussion. Thanks everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.